You know, I'd rather them do it to an animal, I guess, than to a human being.
I love my animals, and they should be protected. We should all watch out for them.
There is hardly anybody alive today who has not benefited directly from animal research.
Welcome to Assignment Sunday. I'm Walter Rasulullah. For the past 10 years, a cry has gone out across this land, a cry for the rights of animals. Animal rights is one of those issues that stirs deep emotions. It is also a controversy that must be examined from many different angles. Today, we'll look specifically at medical research and how the use of animals in that research has animal rights activists up in arms. WRAL-TV News reporter Drew Griffin files this report.
In Washington, they are being arrested. In Chapel Hill, they are lighting candles in the rain. In Tucson, Arizona, they are destroying laboratories. By all accounts, their numbers are growing, and as they continue to be hauled off by police, their spiritual leader is talking about a revolution.
What we're doing now is simply laying the footer of the next great movement for social change in this country.
They are the lovers of animals who grew from the anti-war movement of the 60s. Now are linked through 7,000 animal rights groups claiming more than 10 million members.
What do we want? Animal rights!
What they want, at the very least, is humane treatment for animals. But if they have their way, you will soon be changing your life, from not eating meat to saying no to fur, leather, and even wool from a sheep's back. At the center of controversy are the 22 million animals that tonight are caged in medical laboratories across the nation, waiting to be used for tomorrow's experiments. 62,000 of them can be found in labs like these at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
There is hardly anybody alive today who has not benefited directly from animal research.
And that is true. It has been basic animal research and testing that has allowed man to replace organs and bones, and every drug that is used in America has been tested on animals. Now, laboratory mice at UNC are paving the way to breakthroughs for cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia.
These are the two most common fatal inherited diseases in children.
Dr. Tom Gaduz is part of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, doctors who want to find new methods for medical research.
We start with the ethical foundation, or the ethical feeling that research on animals is philosophically unethical. And it's just a question of tradition, that animals have traditionally been used in medical school teaching labs in the United States.
But is the answer to free laboratory animals like these mice? The cost of stopping animal research may be the cost of stopping medical advancement.
I don't think you or many of the viewers would be willing to be the first person to swallow a powerful drug or have it injected into your body without it having first been tested in some whole animal systems.
Dr. Walter Tucker believes the animal rights activists are misinformed, but he admits their message is getting out and it's taking its toll on science.
I'm not going to be intimidated because there's critical research, much critical research that remains to be done.
But more and more researchers are coming face to face with the animal rights protesters, and philosophers like NC State's Tom Regan say lab work in the U.S. is about to change.
These people are under attack by everybody. They're on the edge of a nervous breakdown, a kind of collective nervous breakdown, because there is no one defending them except themselves.
A recent poll done by Parents Magazine showed that although a majority of Americans disapproved of killing of animals for sport and for furs, 58% accept using animals for medical research as long as the research is done humanely. Is it important to use animals for medical research, or are there alternatives to using live animals? We'll look at these questions and the tactics being used by some animal rights groups, so stay with us.
So I don't agree with it.
There are some kinds of research for which it is probably perfectly appropriate to use animals in research, but it should always be done humanely.
Animal rights, and joining me are Dr. Bob Wood, professor of pediatrics at the University of North Carolina Medical School. He's also chief of pediatric pulmonary medicine And by satellite from Washington, D.C., Dr. Neal Barnard of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. He is also medical advisor for PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And welcome to both of you. The first question that I have for both of you is, do we really need animals for research, or are there alternatives? And Dr. Wood, why don't I let you take that first, and then we'll hear from Neal.
Thank you, Walty. I'm pleased to be here. I'm a pediatrician, but I'm also a medical scientist with a PhD in medical physiology. And I want to state categorically that on the issue of the use of animals in biomedical research, the position of the animal rights advocates is morally, ethically, and scientifically wrong. The use of animals in biomedical research is absolutely essential, has been, and will continue to be. Despite naive claims to the contrary, there simply are no non-animal models that are suitable for use in all biomedical research. Despite claims to the contrary, animals that are used in research are not subjected to unnecessary pain, they're not mistreated. More than 90% of the animals that are used in biomedical research are rats and mice. And even in the use of the rats and mice, the care practices and the research practices are very tightly controlled, both by law and by the principles of good science. If you don't take care of your animals, you can't do good science. These animals that are used are subjected to the same treatment as the 15 million cats and dogs that are killed in our animal shelters every year for the sole purpose of getting them off the street. I absolutely reject what I consider to be the foolish notion that the lives of mice and rats are at least as worthy or even worth more than the lives of any human beings. As a practicing pediatrician, I find that almost everything I do is involved in the care of animals, or it was developed from the care of animals and the use of animals in research.
So from your perspective, they have to be used for animals?
They absolutely have to be used.
Let's hear from Dr. Barnard.
Well, there are, I think, several important points. It's pretty clear that our society is very much in a process of change, and doctors are in that same process. We have now thousands upon thousands of doctors who are concerned, first of all, that the animals clearly do suffer in laboratories, not just from painful experiments, which are still very common, such as the LSU cat shootings that people have probably heard about. The Army's been paying $2.1 million to shoot cats through the head. The only finding that they had was that cats shot through the head stopped breathing. Now, the Army pays a lot of money for a lot of things, but unfortunately, what this example shows is that there's just not very good accountability. But even in a routine laboratory, the caging, the manipulation, the isolation is very, very stressful for animals, and it's not something that we can just pretend isn't there. Now, happily, there's a shift in American medicine, and that's toward a very, very different approach to our chronic diseases. It's a risk factor approach. We've seen this in heart disease particularly. Rather than simply concentrating on animal experiments, say feeding butter to cats and dogs or whatever, we look at populations, and we see who gets heart disease, who doesn't, and what are the risk factors. We can then intervene on those risk factors. Now, this has caused medicine to really have to retool and change, and it's pretty clear that animal experiments are going to be de-emphasized. Now, it certainly is true that there isn't one animal experiment that can be, or there isn't one alternative that can replace every animal experiment. But it's important to remember that many of the modern technologies that are evolving today are in fact better than animal experiments. If you're testing drugs or pesticides for their capacity to cause cancer, for example, animal tests are very, very slow, very expensive, and very poor tests. We now have new methods that are faster, cheaper, and they spare animals a tremendous amount of pain.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about the fact that animal cruelty in labs. Are there not federal government regulations that factor into this position of the fact that these animals should be cared for in a humanely fashion?
There are regulations, but it doesn't make the laboratory environment very humane. The Animal Welfare Act was passed in 1966, and to this day, it has language exempting all animals that are involved in experiments. So you might be covered by the act when you arrive at the lab, but once the experiment begins, you're not covered. And the rats and mice that the doctor mentioned are also not covered by the regulations. They were simply left out as an oversight. Most species of animals that are used in labs are not covered because the enforcers only want to deal with the popular species. They enforce it for primates, dogs, and cats, and so forth, but they don't enforce the act at all for rats, mice, and most of the other animals used in laboratories. Finally, the General Accounting Office looked at the labs a few years ago, and they found that over half the labs in the largest states were never inspected at all. Even so, 114 sites had major violations of the Act. So the bottom line is the regulations are abysmally poor. They are, by and large, not enforced, and there are still plenty of violations.
Dr. Wood?
Dr. Barnard, most of those violations are simple things like having 180 square feet in the room instead of 200 square feet in the room.
No,
Nobody
these are major violations.
Nobody can seriously claim that a serious scientist is going to mistreat his animals. He'd be a fool if he did. A mistreated animal is not an animal that's going to give you good scientific data, and all scientists know that. The claim that animals are mistreated in research is a malicious lie.
Well, shooting cats through the head, 700 over at LSU, is not, in my view, humane treatment.
Dr. Barnard, as a psychiatrist, I don't think you deal with patients with major head injuries. I do. I work a lot in the intensive care unit, and it pains me greatly to see children with major head injuries that I don't know enough to treat effectively.
And you want to tell the parents of these children that shooting cats through the head is the answer? What we did at the Physicians Committee is we have thousands of doctors from all specialties, and we asked our neurosurgeons and our neurologists and trauma experts to simply look at this experiment and say, is this useful or isn't it? The only finding that they had was that animals shot through the head stopped breathing, and in fact, precisely the same experiment was done before by a researcher named Victor Horsley in 1894. So I would like to pretend that animals are well treated in labs, that being shot through the head and recovering isn't a problem, that really contributes to human health. Let's face it, it really doesn't, and we've got to clean up.
What's the alternative to dealing with head injuries?
That's a great question. In an experiment like that, the alternative is simply not to bother doing it because it's a $2.1 million waste. But we now have really a whole technology we didn't used to have. It doesn't make the problem go away, but we study it in different ways. When I was in medical school, CT scans were just coming in. These are scanners that allow you to see the inside of the brain without harming the patient, and we now get these scans in the process of treating patients. Researchers are looking at the results of those scans and also what we call PET scans, positron emission tomography, and MRI, and doing new kinds of research. And the value of that is that head injuries on animals are really very, very different often from head injuries in people. The anatomy is different, the structure of the brain is different. And it's certainly true there's a lot of head injury that I'm concerned about as a doctor. In fact, I do see head-injured people who have dementia and other problems. I'm concerned about that. But when I see animal experiments of this type, I'm concerned it's just a waste of money. It isn't benefiting anyone, and in fact, it's distracting us from what we need to be doing.
When I stand at the bedside and try to treat a child who has a head injury, a CT scan is certainly helpful to me, but it doesn't give me nearly enough information to know how to restore that child's injured brain.
And shooting cats does? That's the problem. Shooting cats isn't going to help you. And what I would like you to do, doctor, is to join us and say, let's admit it. There are some pretty gruesome experiments that are going on.
What you would like for me to do is say, let's abandon all research, and that's totally unacceptable.
What I would say is this. I would agree with you that animal research isn't going to end tomorrow or next year or 10 years from now. It's pretty entrenched in what's going on, whether we like it or not. But if you would agree with me that we can make some improvements and we can get rid of some of these bad guys, then I think we'd be way ahead of the game, and I don't think that's too much to ask.
Dr. Barnard, let me pose a question to you. What if someone in your family had a life-threatening injury and it related to a head injury, and you had to rely on something that medical science research had brought to the fore? Would you accept that information and make use of it in a saving factor?
Sure. I don't think there's any problem with that for really two reasons. One is that most research is not animal research. Most research that we see and read every day in our journals is clinical research, it's lab bench research, it's epidemiology. Some is animal, but it's not a minority. The other thing is, if things were gained on animals and we can use that knowledge, I have no problem with that at all. The question is, what are we going to do to alleviate the suffering that goes on right now, both of our patients and of laboratory animals? If we look at diseases like head injury, like cancer, like AIDS, the animal models are abysmally poor. Cancer death rates are going up 1% per year, and I have family members that have died of cancer while so many animal tests have gone on. But we now have technologies to test anti-cancer drugs in human cells rather than in animals. We have ways of preventing cancer, but we're ignoring them because we're so busy doing animal tests that really aren't getting us anywhere.
Dr. Barnard, we're going to take a break. Dr. Woods, we're going to take a break right here. When we return, we'll have more of our discussion of animal rights, so stay with us.
I feel that if it's absolutely necessary, I think that animals should be used, but if it's not necessary, it's just a waste.
I don't like it at all. It upsets me terribly.
In cases where humans will die or have serious problems, then they should use animals, but they shouldn't use them in laboratory research for mascara. It's stupid.
Wood, Professor of Pediatrics at the UNC School of Medicine, and by satellite from Washington, D.C., Dr. Neal Barnard of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. Dr. Barnard, when we took that break there, you were talking about how advanced technology today can help us in discovering how to treat certain illnesses and repair certain injuries. Dr. Wood,
yes.
Would you respond to that, please?
Well, I agree that we need to use every tool at our disposal. And certainly, there are alternatives to the use of animals in certain circumstances, and we certainly use them. And let's look at the main ones that have been proposed. First of all are computers. Computers can model a lot of things, but a computer is a tool. It manipulates information, but does not generate information. And if we're smart enough to program the computer to tell us what we need to know about the animal, then we don't need to do the experiment in the first place. We simply don't know enough. A fool with a tool is still a fool. And that's what we are when we use computers. Now,
well,
computer programs also have some value in teaching. But I can guarantee you that a computer simulation is not an adequate substitute for real experience. When I have a surgeon standing over me with a knife, I want him to have operated on living tissue before, not practiced on a computer simulation.
So you want a veterinarian, evidently. A person who's practiced on animals. And you can do a heart transplant, you can learn a coronary artery bypass without ever practicing on animals at some of the best cardiovascular research, training centers in the United States. If you go into an animal lab and practice surgery on them, you become very competent in veterinary surgery, and that shouldn't make the patient very confident. You need a surgeon who's trained in a 5-year residency.
A major part of that training program, I think, needs to be on living animal tissues, where mistakes can be made, where techniques can be learned without risking human lives. That's the bottom line.
That's not the way surgical residencies work. The way you work is you observe.
I know very well how surgical residencies work, and I know that they would work a lot better if students and early residents had good, thorough grounding in animal surgery before they approach human tissue.
Well, the way they work is you observe and assist at the elbows of trained surgeons, and in the course of assisting at surgery, you learn how to tie knots, how to make incisions, how to do the pieces of the operation. And when you do it yourself for the first time, it's under close observation. And like it or not, that's the way surgeons are trained. That's where their competence comes from. Animal labs, at most, are a detail, and there are a great many institutions that simply don't even offer them anymore.
And I think to the great detriment of medical education.
Let's look at the medical students are delighted about it, I must tell you.
Let's look at the second major area that we use as replacement for animals, and that's tissue culture. You make a lot of that in what you talk about.
And with good reason. It's a tremendously growing industry.
Tissue culture cells
it's wonderful in terms of testing.
Tissue culture cells are very important for very limited applications, but they're very dangerous in their eventual interpretation because they're a single cell type. They're not organized as a tissue. They don't have organs. They don't have blood circulation, etc. Yes, you can use tissue culture, for example, to screen potentially carcinogenic compounds. And if that compound is harmful to the tissue, then you can infer that it's going to be harmful to the animal. But there are many, many times.
Won't you agree with us to phase out the animal tests that are used for carcinogenicity?
Absolutely not. The tissue culture testing is only the first stage.
Well, the problem is these animal tests are grotesquely cruel. The animals are dosed.
They are not grotesquely cruel.
Well, how would you feel about having a tube thrust into your stomach every day of your life with a pesticide put into it, and then at the end of your life, you're then cut into 10,000 pieces and examined? That's not fun. These animals are picked up by the scruff of their backs, the hard metal tube is thrust into their throat, down their stomach, and DDT or floor wax, whatever you're testing, it goes in. It's not fun, and what's more, it's bad for consumers because it's very, very expensive. It takes so long that if you are concerned about something you're exposed to, like alar that was sprayed on apples and so forth, if you're going to wait for animal tests to give you the answer. You may as well forget it for 5, 10 years. The cell cultures and the computer models that the doctor mentioned have, in the past several years, gotten an accuracy that's as good as the animal tests, or certainly in the ballpark, and they're so much faster that we can have a safer environment that much faster.
Cancer is a whole lot less fun than being picked up by the scruff of your neck.
Exactly, and as long as we rely on animal tests, we're going to have cancer caused by these environmental pollutants. We've got to have a faster testing method.
Tissue culture cells are useful for initial screening, but they must then be verified in living animal models. Tissue culture cells are simply too simple a system. For example, many drugs are metabolized in the body into different drugs which may themselves be carcinogenic. That may not happen in a tissue culture cell.
But it can happen if you design your culture properly. As you well know, that's now being done. There are people working with liver cells to cause metabolites to occur, and so forth. The point is, I know you'd like to test everything on animals, but the National Academy of Sciences years ago said that the majority of pesticides and other chemicals in common use, we just don't know their effects, and it's clear that if we wait for animal tests to give us the answers, we'll never get done. They're just too slow and too expensive.
You're certainly right in saying we don't know enough, and that is why testing in animals, in addition to testing in every other system that's available to us, is necessary.
So we are saying, in terms of as we move along in society today, we will have advances that perhaps will, at one day, will they rid us of having to do animal testing, or is this always going to be a part of the picture?
Animal testing will never be completely eliminated, because the ultimate animal test is the test in this kind of animal. We humans are animals too, and eventually we must test in the intact organism, namely the human. I find that it is not ethical or moral to do so until we have used every means at our disposal, tissue culture cells, computer simulations, and many different species of living animals, before we test in humans, to make as certain as we possibly can that the risk is minimized and the probability of benefit is maximized. To do otherwise is immoral.
The animal tests simply don't do that. We had Zomax that we were using, and I'm sure you were using in your emergency rooms. It killed people. It looked safe in animals, but it killed people, and we had to pull it off the market. We had a new antidepressant called namifencine that was marketed worldwide after it looked safe in animals. It killed a lot of people. We had to pull it off the market. To pretend that animal tests are some guarantee of safety is ludicrous. Moreover,
what would have been the ultimate in finding out, in discovering that was a positive drug?
The problem is that when we went to animals with the confidence, when we went to people with the confidence of testing on animals, we found that people didn't behave the same way animals did. Now, I don't mean to give a glib answer and suggest that it's easy to replace all animal tests. I'm not suggesting that. I think it's a challenge in many areas. But what I am suggesting is this. If we're going to dig our heels in and say, let's stick with animal tests, number one, you will never get the pesticides and so forth tested because they're too expensive and too cumbersome. And number two, you are guaranteeing more thalidomides, more Zomaxes, more namifencine because these chemicals slip through. Thalidomide, for example, it didn't cause birth defects in animals first, then later certain species were found that did get the stumps where their hands should be and so forth. But then toxicologists said, well, which animals do I believe? Do we believe the rats and mice that didn't? Do we believe primates? And some of them said, as the doctor says, well, let's just test on every animal we can get our hands on. If you do that, you'll find that some species get birth defects and others don't. And you're left with a regulatory
approve that drug for use in humans.
Well, that isn't obviously the way the FDA has been working at all. If you've been reading your package inserts on even something such as Valium, it clearly causes birth defects and it is clearly on the market. So animal tests are no guarantee of safety. Quite often they lead us astray. That doesn't mean it's easy to necessarily move beyond them, but in many areas that technology is quite good and we should embrace it rather than reject it. Animal tests just aren't the answer.
Dr. Barnard, thank you very much. Dr. Wood, thank you very much. We're out of time. Stay with us. We'll be back with some closing thoughts in just a moment.
I think research is something that could be limited more than it's used right now.
I don't think it's a very good idea at all. I think they have the technology to, test products without having to use animals, and I think they should do it.
I don't really feel that it's right. I mean, if it's harming them a lot, like the one with the Avon, how it was harming them, I don't think that was right. I think that there are other ways possibly of finding out if a certain type of makeup can harm an animal.
program or any other topics we've done on Assignment Sunday, please write us here at Assignment Sunday, P.O. Box 12,000, Raleigh 27605. Until next week, I'm Walty Rasulullah for Assignment Sunday.